Okay, so today we're talking about hey, people out there in the universe, we're
Yeah,
composers. At least we tell ourselves we are. Uh,
yeah. Happy New Year. We're finally back for the new year.
Happy
Yep.
New Year almost in February.
Yes.
Chinese New Year is coming up, so it's fine.
I have a story from New Year's, but it's not for the board podcast. Oh, what a mess of an island. So today we are discussing, we're talking about what it means to have an Opus One, or what is the perception of having an Opus One. Using Megan's Opus One, her perceived Opus One as an example, right? I think
Yeah.
that's what we're doing here today. So, should we begin by listening to it? I think so. Then let's speak
Sure.
a bit about it. And its title is Conversation, and it's for violin and timpani, a very unusual combination of
Uh-huh.
instrumentation, like a combination of instruments. Uh, so let's go. Okay, and that's it.
Yeah.
So it seems to be like a very antiphonal piece to me.
Yeah. Um,
Wow. What can you tell us about this piece? It's a conversation. Um,
yeah. I mean, the piece is an old piece of mine. Obviously, it's from 2007. I was a freshman at Northwestern. I was 19 at the time. I had been writing music since I was a little kid, but it was, mostly I kind of started, improvising on the keyboard, then writing my ideas down, and they were kind of largely what I was experienced with, which was, classical and romantic style music. I think gradually it got more and more dissonant. And I was always criticized for um, when I was young, for my music being too dense and for my pitch language not making any sense, because I think it probably didn't make any sense. I think I just was like trying to make it sound really virtuosic. And then right before this, I was doing some
you never
12
had
tone.
like a system for organizing pitches.
That was not one that I did, but not so much one that I really felt um, strongly about when I was young. Um, I mean, a lot of times it was just a key that was my system, but then when I started to try to get more dissonance for a while, I would say no. And then I started having pieces that were more or less 12 tone. Um, and I hated writing music like that. But I liked the fact that I could explain the music. Um, but yeah, I was at the point with it that I was just kind of decided, you know what, I don't think I'm gonna be a composer. I was just had finished my first term as a composition major at Northwestern, and I had kind of been one of those people that knew kind of what they wanted to do for pretty much their whole life. So I'm like, I don't even know what else I want to do. But I was like pretty sure I didn't want to be a composer. But then for whatever I had to sign up for classes, and because I didn't know what else I wanted to take, I'm like, well, I'm just gonna sign up for this composition class. And this was a class. It was one of the best classes I've probably ever taken. It was a class taught by Aaron Cassidy, who is at Northwestern, just my first year there, and it was called Composer Performer, and it was about composer performer relationships, um, and writing pieces for particular performers, and it was a graduate class. And it was a very unique experience that Northwestern did let undergraduates take classes with graduate students. I'm sure they had, different expectations for the group, but you were, still around in the same class with those same people. And the first day we were we had to assign our groups. So the Catherine Barnes was the timpanist, and she was the original timpanist. That recording had Austin Welliman, who's a great violinist, but he wasn't the original violinist I wrote it for. The original violinist I wrote it for, that performance was a performance, I think 3 years after I wrote it. I think it was the video is all crazy. I'm kind of thinking in my head, I'm like wondering if my little sister must have recorded it, who would have been like 11 or 12, very young at the time, because the panning is so crazy. But anyways, yeah, Ari Strasfeld was the original violinist on it, and so when we picked groups for this piece, Ari Strasfeld was a master's student, and Catherine was an upperclassman percussion major. And Ari was one of the original violinists of Jack. And Jack was just starting to kind of have a presence and a name. They had worked with Lackaman and a lot of big name composers and done really, exciting things. And I kind of knew of like the prestigious things that he had done. And so he just kind of like, okay, go around, talk to every musician here, and end up in your group based on who you jive with. And I knew his first teacher. I'm like, I was the only, like, the youngest person in the class by a lot. Was all other graduate students. And so I'm like, I'm not even going to bother talking to Ari because one of the graduate students will want to work with them or whatever. So I go around and I talk to every other person. And then while I'm doing that, Catherine had just come with an agenda. She wanted to play the timpani. She loves the timpani. And then Ari had come with the agenda that he really was interested in a piece for violin and some kind of percussion. And so they teamed up together, and all the other more sensible, older composers denied that combination. And they had all went to other musicians, and they seemed willing to work with me, and so I was excited about that prospect until I realized, wait, these instruments have no range in common. They're sonically about as different you can get. And they wanted it to be part of the assignment. They wanted it to be like a true duo, not like a solo with accompaniment. Yeah, it was just ended up being an amazing experience because I was at a point I didn't want to be a composer anymore. And it was the best mindset I could have because it was the first time since I didn't see a future in it. I didn't care what people thought about what I was writing. And it kind of just allowed me to be my authentic self. Um, this was very strikingly different from anything I've written before. Um, yeah, and I think I just was a little bit like I was just much more myself. Um, and I just had like I had such a fun time writing the piece. The piece is still like close to my heart. And it was just a great experience. Like we part of the class we met several times a week and we would just experiment and try things out. We'd get to know each other. And we were supposed to, try to put the personalities of the performers um, in the piece. Yeah, and it was just a lot of fun. And yeah, it did become, I think, a lot of a conversation between the two instruments. I think my starting point was really trying to explore like how what kind of similarities do these instruments have that have nothing on paper that's obviously similar. So I had to explore extended techniques for the first time, which was something that I was very much not open to previously. Um, and I explored that. I explored really kind of looking at timbre. Um, I explored more kind of gestures, which was really new. And like some of the things that I came up with that okay, they both have glissandos in the same way that they're um, straight. They're even glissandos. They're not like if I were to play a glissando on horn, you would get all the steps and the bumps. Where both violin and timpani are capable of doing a smooth glissando. So that became part of the piece. And they both, the gesture like bop, 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 because the bow can drop and bounce, and so can the mallet. So that was another gesture that was in common. And I was kind of interested in virtuosity a little bit, but I kind of realized, well, the timpani can sound more virtuosistics if you don't have super precision on the pitch. So there's sometimes when they're playing faster, more virtuosic sounding gestures, I have contours instead of specific. Maybe might have a starting pitch or something. I have more contours than specific pitches because they can change the notes really fast if they don't have to be so concerned about listening in and tuning for a specific pitch. Yeah, and then like I had fun with sounds that they could make together. So the mallet on the violin, which was totally Ari Streisfeld's idea. He was super excited about doing that. He's a unique violinist. And it just that became really kind of a fun interaction. That he was so excited to try this new thing, but then also kind of terrified to have a mallet on his instrument. And the percussionist was pretty terrified to hit somebody else's instrument. So there's this like really kind of a funny dynamic about that. And then in the end, the violin plucks into the timpani drum when it's the pedal is being moved. So it's and it kind of it doesn't come across that strong in that recording, but in real life it does. Like it takes the resonance and it glissandos the resonance because it acts just as a big resonator. So that's kind of was the basis, and it kind of became a conversation between the voices, kind of highlighting both like the differences a little bit, but I think I tried to focus more on the similarities because that was a little bit harder and kind of stretched me outside my box of comfortability with this particular instrumentation.
I think that yeah, you kind of found them with the glissandi, for examul, and uh, pizzicati
Mhm.
pizzicatos and stuff like that, using the violin as percussion and kind of like trying to use the timpani more like in a melodic manner. I can see that in contrast with your other pieces, there are melodies here.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Would you say full melodies or definitely motives for sure? Um,
At least
it-
melodic gestures,
yeah, yeah,
glissandi type
yeah,
melodies.
It
yeah.
quite expressive actually.
Huh?
Yeah.
What
It's
did
quite
I think
expressive.
so.
Yeah,
what
And I think
expression is you say?
maybe
expressive.
that related
Express
to my I think that related a lot to like I think my music before that was quite expressive, and I think
this
the
one.
music I wrote in Buffalo especially was less expressive. And I think in retrospect it was because I wrote all this stuff, and then like I think it got pretty good reactions from audience, which I think it typical, not all my pieces, but like typical some of my stronger works, they get a good reaction from audience members, but not from like competitions or prestige, or academia. Um, and I think that was kind of the reaction I got from my teachers. They were very positive about the piece, but they're like, oh well, but it's not the kind of piece that's going to win an award or anything like that. Which I mean, they were right, but I think I was a little bit taken back by those kind of comments at that age. I mean, I was 19 at the time, and
18? 18?
I was 19. Yeah, I was 19
I think
19?
it.
when I wrote that. I was really taken back by that. And I think part of me um, really strived to have a. I wanted to do this kind of thing. I was very passionate about it, but I think I tried so hard to make it have a very serious tone to it, to make it seem serious in the academia. And I think I did that for years. I think I did it through pretty all of Buffalo. To be honest, I think all the pieces I wrote as a graduate student, they all had kind of a more serious, stoic, dark kind of tone to it. And I think that I
I
have
wouldn't
that
say
side to
it's
me, but it's
stoic.
only one
It's not really.
side. And the first piece, and I think in the years since, I mean, there's not melodic in the same way, but I think I do have some little motives, and sometimes, and I think my pieces aren't afraid to, be lighthearted or humorous or funny at times. I mean, that I have a bigger palette of attitudes, I guess I'm willing to express. I think I did express them in this piece because I was at a moment when I didn't care, but then because I didn't think I was going to be a composer, but then I fell in love with composition, and then I was still in the academia trying to pursue it. Um, yeah, and so I think I'm kind of getting back to the mindset I was in this piece, even though um, my music has developed quite a lot since that time. But there are some things about like the like some I think that I wrote this piece very intuitionally, I would say. And there's a lot of things that I see here that are things that I do very consciously now. In particular, I was noting the very like kind of ridiculously slow violin bliss. Um, would be something I'd be like really super into. I'd probably even do it more exaggerated. So I really love like super slow gestures that are so slow that they become like uneven because um, like the bow can't pot. The bow you can only move so slow without being even, and then if you move slow enough that you're kind of shaking and going still and then going a little faster. um, and I find that really fascinating. And I think part of that maybe was subconsciously maybe in there now I'm looking back, but it definitely wasn't something I wasn't consciously thinking about gestures in that way. Um, that,
And I think the music is also very poetic when they are like the piece is like consisting of like fragments, and there are lots of like short pauses, and then for me it's very elastic, and and I think everything works very coherently. If I mean, if we were not told that this is your opus one, I would think that this maybe is your like your first piece in your grad school or your final piece uh, at college, something like that.
Hmm.
It didn't sound like a first piece written at college, something like that. Yeah,
Nice.
and and quite adventurous. And actually, at the beginning, I didn't watch the video. I just listen to it. I try not
Yeah.
to read the score. I try not to watch the video, and then and then when I looked at the video, I just realized, oh, the violinist hits the body of the instrument with mallets, and
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
are there are lots of experiments here, and I
Hopefully not too
um
strongly.
probably a cheap instrument was used. I don't know, but
No,
but
they used the real instrument.
oh really?
They
I'm
did, but they didn't hit it didn't they didn't hit the instrument very hard. It's just they hit it pretty lightly. It just because it's a soundboard, it resonates, and the timpani player wasn't playing very loud either, so it balanced. But yeah, they used their real instruments.
the writing for the timpani is very inspiring because I always struggle with this instrument. Whenever I need to write for it, I feel really bad, both for
I
myself and the timpanist.
I mean, I was very lucky that I had very a ton of access to the performers. So I mean, I was like constantly trying things out and exploring the instrument. So I got to know the instrument very very well. And I would say like we've talked about collaboration before, and I've talked about how collaboration is important to me, and some pieces have a greater level than others, and I would say this is has a high degree. Probably the only other piece I feel like that I have that has this high of a degree is probably liaison, which is they're both probably the two pieces that I hold the most dearest to my heart. So obviously, maybe that's the key, is this close collaboration. Um, but yeah,
I would.
I and I also studied other. I mean, there's not a lot of pieces that feature timpani in this kind of way. A lot of times it's just like orchestral timpani, which is much different. The pieces I do remember studying Elliott Carter's solo timpani pieces, are actually pieces he wrote in Buffalo. Um, but I mean, I didn't know that at the time. But I studied a lot of his
Buffalo?
timpani pieces. Yeah, he wrote them. He wrote them in Buffalo as a creative associate
Didn't
for
know.
Jan Williams. Yep. And he worked very closely. Worked very closely, and he developed a lot of new techniques and new notation for the timpani through that piece. And a lot of the timpani notation does come from Elliott Carter, I would say here.
Hmm. I should have studied more then. Yeah. Yeah.
More of Elliot Carter, you mean?
More Eric Carter. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not a big fan of his music.
I'm
Yeah.
no, I mean I don't dislike his music really, but I'm not a huge fan normally. But I would say the timpani pieces are very different than like the music that maybe he's more known for,
Mm-hmm.
because they're just I think maybe because of the instrumentation, they're for solo timpani. There's no accompaniment or anything. It's very more unusual. Um, they're a little bit more like reminiscent of Barrio, I would say, and how he approaches solo writing. um, yeah, than you would typically expect from Elliot Carter. You don't have, I think when I think of Elliot Carter, I think of a lot of the multi divisions of time and time signatures.
Metric
And you don't,
modulation.
Metric modulation.
yeah, and you don't really have that in the solo timpani pieces because there's just not. It's just a solo for one instrument. That's not.
And
Yeah.
somehow your piece reminded me of Toshio Hosokawa in his vertical time study. I believe the title was like that. The violin and piano, and they are they are like very active, explosive fragments, and then collected by elastic long harmonies. I I know your piece and his were very different, but somehow your the piece reminded me of that. Maybe because of the fragmentary nature in some of the passages. Um,
Yeah.
but I think no disrespect to Toshio Hosokawa, but I think your piece is more adventurous, and yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I was in a, it's kind of fun. I was in a perfect position to be adventurous because I was in a position where I don't necessarily care about what people think of me. And it was kind of I mean, I think in grad school, I wanted to be in that place where I didn't care what people think of me, but I don't know if I totally was. I mean, there was a lot of we had a lot of really impressive colleagues that did impressive things. And I definitely wanted to feel um, at that same level. And I don't think I was quite there, but I was there for this one piece because I'm like, oh, I'm not going to be a composer. And I think I'm definitely more at that place at this point in my life. But yeah, it was like kind of maybe I was able to mentally be at that place. I was able to be adventurous because of that. I think it was very fragmented because I think that was about as long as I had the attention span for the phrase as a 19-year-old. I think that was just it was written extremely intuitively. Um,
It,
and
somehow
yeah.
maybe because of that the piece uh was pretty expressive, because maybe this is a very this this piece has a lot of like personal, maybe subconsciously, but a lot of personal things, personal ideas inside.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I mean,
less
yeah,
calculated.
I do think it's very reflective of who I was, at least as a 19-year-old. I think my who I am as a person and as a composer has evolved significantly since then. I mean, as you know, hopefully most people evolve from, I'm in my late 30s now, from 19. So
I have a totally irrelevant question. So how do you decide that this is your opus one?
I was
um,
thinking the same thing. Yeah.
yeah, so I decided that this is my Opus One because I think it's the earliest piece I have that I can see like the ancestors to like the things I'm interested in now and the way I think. Whereas if I were to present like I think the first piece I wrote in paper, I improvised for a long time. I was maybe like, I don't know, probably like 10 or something when the first piece I wrote on paper. And I still remember the melodies and stuff. I was singing it earlier. It's like as a joke with my husband. And yeah, it was very, very, it was very, it's very abstracted from anything I think I'm interested in now. It was very much kind of it was kind of romantic, kind of a hybrid of romantic classical kind of era, but it wasn't very contemporary in style. And yeah, I think this is the first piece where I think there's like a linear progression from this piece to other works I have, to the work I'm creating now, and I think there was a clear break. When I presented this work, people were very shocked, because it was very different from the work I submitted to be accepted to the conservatory there. And I had written a piece for like a reading the first semester that was like this. It was some 12-tone piece that really sucked. But I wrote it, and and I think people. I had presented in like colloquiums pieces I wrote in high school and stuff. So I think people kind of thought they knew what I was interested in, and this was like not that whatsoever. So people were kind of really surprised. It was a very sudden style shift, and I don't know if I've had any. I haven't had any style shifts that have been that drastic. It's kind of, my music has kind of linearly progressed from there, I would say. Yeah. And I think if somebody came up to me and wanted to play this piece, I would still be pretty excited about it. I mean, I don't know if it's the best piece I've ever written, but it's a piece that I still have positive feelings about it. I don't know if it's from the piece itself or the experience, but I like the piece. I would be happy if people wanted to perform it. I'd be a little bit embarrassed if people played pieces that were older than that. I mean, there's a few pieces in between this piece and what I'm now that I would be a little various degrees of embarrassed to have performed. But I think it would be okay with any of them. But yeah.
What about
Do you guys consider your Opus 1 to be like the first piece you ever wrote in your whole life, or the first piece that you felt like? I feel like this is the first piece that I felt like I was myself in, I guess, too.
I have a hard time because I keep making my work list shorter and shorter. So gradually I don't know which one is my first so-called the Opus 1. Yeah, I would say when I'm older and older, when I'm aging, I feel like more and more pieces are becoming more and more embarrassing. So I have less and less pieces. Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, I don't know. For me, I guess I just get, sometimes I get really close to my pieces, and like when I'm writing them, I'm like very, like almost like emotionally attached to the piece. And some pieces more than others. It doesn't really have to do with the age I am. It's just really more the situation and the people and the experience of writing it. And I feel like sometimes that like kind of jades my ability to actually hear the quality of the piece quite in the same way as other pieces. And this one, I would say I have one of the strongest emotional attachments to. The experience was just really, really incredible. And I can listen to some things critically a little bit, but at the same time, it's a piece. Yeah, it's a piece that I definitely hold close to my heart. I would say probably this piece and Liaison are like the two pieces that I probably have the strongest emotional attachment to.
What about the form? It seems it gives the impression like you talked about fragments, but and it might have to do with it, but it gives me the impression of being through composed in a way.
Yeah, I think it was through
Possibly
composed.
like it was through composed.
I think so. I can't remember exactly, but I I think more or less, like I pretty much wrote it from beginning to end. I think I did, I did edit or add like a gesture once in a while in the middle, but it was more or less. I do remember Ari Streisfeld, um, who was he knew I learned a lot from him because he knew a lot about, and he would give me music to listen to because he was, but even at that point, he was a master student. And he was very knowledgeable in contemporary music, and it was a very new and extremely exciting world to me at that point. Um, but I remember him saying like I would give him music, and he would be like, "Oh yeah, like I feel like the ideas are interesting, but this needs a way more development." And then I would like add like two notes, and then he would be like, he would be surprised that he felt that I'd add two notes and it would suddenly work, whereas he felt like, oh, it would need a lot of material added. um but yeah, so I think it was pretty much, it was very, I think the form is very linear. um Probably like a to b, a b. I think everything about the piece is linear, and I think, yeah, um a lot of the dynamics are like that. um and I think if I've talked about like that's probably the sound world I prefer, sonically. I often don't do that in my music because it gets very boring to only do that in my music. And my preferences are very limiting, so I often don't go with sounds that I prefer. Um, and I instead find interest in other sounds. Um, but yeah, I think it's very kind of, I have like kind of a starting point where they're a little bit more independent, going to where they're producing one sound together with the pits that has the timpani acting as a resonator. um, and I think it's a very linear progression. And I kind of remember writing list of like sounds that were, and trying to like order them like based on whether I felt they were closer to the one side or the other. And I think I basically went through and used them in that order. Um, yeah, I think formally it is very simple. And I think maybe some of my music is maybe not quite as formally simple as this piece, but I think all of my music is pretty formally simple, um, which has always been a debate. Some people think it's a factor of
I will say
why
that
it works, and some people think that's a criticism. So
I would say that the idea of an opus one is like something in between. Sometimes like you still have some costumes or some habits from your previous life as a composer, and probably it shows in the form, because in the form I can visualize this being an open form, like taking it and ripping it apart into sections and having some sections here and overlapping them, or having later sections being played previously and stuff like that. And I
yeah,
think
I could too. I definitely wouldn't have had. I didn't have the ability at the time to do anything like that.
I will say so, but it
when I
like
was 19.
in the pieces that I know of your pieces that I know, it's like more clear formally. There's the intention is way
Hmm.
stronger. So and I
But
think
the
it
forms are not all that. I don't think any of my pieces have forms that are overly complicated. They're usually fairly simple. And a lot of people think, okay, because I have a lot of times my music is aesthetically complicated and um, yeah, aesthetically complicated, particularly physically complicated, and that the fact that I put it inside these simple forms allows it to speak and not feel so alienating that you can't listen to the piece. Um,
I think it
and
works
other
better.
people criticize it that like, oh wow, you're so I'm thinking so I guess radically about other features of music and not of form. So I mean it just and I am my head is in the former, which is why I continue to do it. But yeah.
I think it works better with simpler forms, but what I'm
Uh-huh.
referring to is like, for example, towards the end, I didn't feel like it was a definitive ending. For example, it was very open ended
Hmm.
from my perception, and that kind of like made me think about the previous materials and how it was used in retrospective. That's like it's not a
Yeah.
bad critique. It's just an observation. What I'm
Yeah,
saying.
I mean, I noticed too. Like I was looking back at the piece, and I'm like, I don't have a double bar at the
I
end or any kind of bar line at the end, and
in
I remember really just disliking the look of it being boxed in. I think conceptually, I kind of had the feeling like, oh, this could like kind of be carried on. Um, and it was more like a piece that I think it's used more in popular cultures where you get like the fade out with the impression that the piece could potentially be continuing for eternity. I think that was maybe more the thought process, or the yeah, it was
I think
definitely a gentle ending.
it makes sense what you're saying, but I also think it has to do with you writing it more intuitively in a way too.
Yeah.
Probably
And I
because
mean, I think I always welcome intuition into my work and writing process, even now, but my music hasn't been, I haven't written a piece that has been, I mean, this piece, I would say, I can't say it was 100% intuitively, but it was like 97% intuitively driven. It was, like I did have like a couple list of techniques and stuff. And yeah, I wouldn't, I haven't written a piece where I have that the intuition is that high of a driving force. Some, I usually have quite a bit of conscious procedures and structures, and then that allow me to be in a little bit intuitive in some of my material.
hmm,
But a lot of depending on the piece too. Like I have pieces where I have so many rules that about the materials I can create, and I can kind of be intuitive with those rules, but they're very limiting. I have fun with limitations, self limitations anyway.
I see that there's a lot of written instructions that we can see in your later music. Uh,
Yeah,
for example, here and here. Well, these are usual for mallets, but yeah, switch to the A string as seamlessly as possible. That would be like a command that you will give in your later music, I would say, or to
yeah,
create a gesture to create music in a way. So Um,
And I was only able to do that at that point because I had consistent access to these players while I was working on it,
mhm.
um, and could kind of, I would share things I was working on, and they would play it, and then they would, I would give feedback, and they would give suggestions about how to achieve what I wanted. So it was very collaborative, um, and yeah, it was just it was a really amazing experience, and I think the collaboration is maybe due to the fact that it maybe sounds like someone a little bit older than 19 wrote it, because I had tools that were greater than, I mean, even greater than I achieve now. Like, usually, if I have a collaborative experience, I get to work with the player 2 times. And that's still great. I'm fortunate for that, but like,
Mhm.
yeah, this was a really ideal experience.
Was this more like working with Bobby and Jason from Crossfire Duo in a
I think
way?
I worked with those 2 players, I think, even more consistently than I worked with Bobby and Jason.
Okay.
I did work with Bobby and Jason quite frequently, but I think this was, I mean, literally in the room a couple times a week with them. I think it was more similar. I think that liaison might be just a tad more collaborative because of the logistics of that piece, but like not much more. Like I mean, I spent a lot of time in the room with people. The Bobby and Jason pieces are, if I have a scale of collaboration, they'd be pretty high on it, but this piece would be a little bit more. Um, I also knew what I was doing, I hope, when I was writing the pieces for Bobby and Jason than I did when I was writing this piece, which I didn't really know what I was doing at all.
Well, but that's yeah, and that will take us to the implications of what is an Opus One. What do you think are the implications of what was an Opus One? Like
I mean, I guess for me, like,
thinking about it, like
it's
uh,
the first piece. Yeah, I think it's like, I think the first piece where I felt like I was being authentically myself. And I was writing.
so that would probably have to
Yeah.
do with like you writing it intuitively for in
Uh-huh.
97% intuitively. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think even though like my pieces now are, maybe they have more processes involved, my processes leave a lot of room for intuition.
It seems
And they
like
just
you
they're more sculpted intuition, where this was more just your, I was researching the instruments with the players, um, figuring out what they can do, making list of like what I could do similarly with the 2 instruments, and then I was just just writing.
I think that what the implication of an Opus One means or suggests is like discovering oneself as an individual, as a musician, as a composer. And that has to do with a lot of self reflection, looking inwards. And that has to do with what you mentioned with uh, intuition, but at the same time, it's kind of like looking at the unconscious, what wants to come out that you have not let come out, and you kind of like let it come out here finally. I would like to see a previous piece to see what kind of like what did you keep from your past self as a composer and what has gone on.
I
uh,
think the biggest like I guess shadows of my past myself
Yeah.
prior to this piece are in the melodic violin gestures.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I think that's probably like,
Yes.
especially the one like da 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 da, so that, like that kind of those little fragments of melody. I think those were um, these maybe look back into
For example, would you say?
um, this was a little bit different, I think. But there is a couple very super kind of melodic, romantic. They're like this, yes. A couple times like that I think
Not the Yetes or Ricochet. The Yetes you
yeah.
said
And I
was
think I mean some of the pitches are indeterminate because I have just contours. But the pitch language I do have was very intuitional, and I think I was really just really kind of going. I think before I was kind of trying to pick pitches that seemed like they would be impressive in my brain. Um, and this one I was kind of really kind of listening and trying to find a pitch language where the pitches weren't over stronger than the gestures, I guess. Um, yeah, and they were very intuitional. I think I pretty much chose them by voice. I think I sang a lot of them and just wrote them down as I was writing, if I can remember right.
I think it's very cool that you could find yourself as an artist and composer at 19. A lot of people in their 30s and 40s, I think that you cannot say that about them. Or, well, I'm not gonna throw shade at anyone, but or any group of people.
Yeah, I mean,
It's like,
I was just like in the right time, and it wasn't even just the performers. Like the other, I had mentioned before, like the other graduate students were very influential, and they were very the instead of kind of I don't know how I would have been like if we had that experience. The graduate students weren't integrated at Buffalo at all. I would have been the same, but they were instead of being like, oh, that's just like a little kid or whatever, they were very welcoming to me. And
little sister.
yeah, like, and there was quite a few of them that really just took me under their wing and were mentoring and just were just very influential to me at such a young age. I think a lot of I don't like to tie myself too strongly with Aaron Cassidy just because I think by doing so people miss a lot what's in my music. But as a teacher, he's just a phenomenal teacher, and he was able to like say things about, especially about I was very closed off to contemporary music, I think, before. And just how a lot of people who just have no education on it are. They're just like, oh, that's just weird, or that's not the way music is supposed to be. Um, and I think the only difference with me is that I did I didn't want to just accept, oh, that sounds bad or that sounds ugly and leave it at that. I kind of wanted to figure out, oh, why do I feel that way about this piece, about this or whatever. And usually when I went to the process of trying to figure that out, I changed my opinions. Um, but yeah, he made a lot of like extended technique and contemporary music in general seem very approachable to me, and really spark a curiosity and really a love for it, in ways that I other when I had been exposed to it before, I was not very open to it, I would say. Um, yeah. And so I think, yeah, him as a teacher was very influential on me, in that respect. And yeah, these graduate composers, and the fact that I, you know, had these really amazing musicians who were far more experienced than me, and they were very mentoring to me. They taught me a ton about music in general and their instruments, but um, they also treated me with respect. They didn't, you know, decide not to put effort into the piece because I was this 19-year-old composer who had no idea what they were doing. It was totally breaking away from what I was doing stylistically. They were very respectful and serious. They were just, a perfect. They were amazing, to work with. Um, yeah, and I tried to put the experience of working with those players and those particular players in the piece as much as I could, because that was the assignment, and it's something that I really enjoy doing in general. Like, to this day, I love having a performer muse, I guess, for my pieces.
Yeah, that at least you. That's pretty nice to have support in your own school. I would say, uh, especially when you come from a conservative background, particularly when you're kind of like finding yourself and finding these
Yeah.
techniques. I kind of have a problem with the term nowadays because they they should. I don't know if they should be considered like normal techniques at this point.
Oh, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I see what you're saying. They're just other techniques. Yeah.
At this point, like we've used them, the musical language has evolved so much and it's been established so much. But then again, I don't know if I'm speaking from a place of
I mean, I think also in terms of study, they are very still much extended, because if someone wants to be a violinist and goes through all the years of study and goes to a conservatory, their vast majority of their studies is going to be on conventional techniques. They're not going to be spending a long time doing crazy harmonics and
scratch tones or
scratch tones and playing behind the bridge. That's not going to be the focus of their studies. I think it should be something that they're familiar with, and capable of doing. It often isn't, though. Like, there's a lot of, I would say, actually the majority of people can go through training, conservatory training, or university training, or whatever, and not have any experience with that. Um, yeah, and even those who do, like, the Ari Strasfeld or Austin Wallyman, who played my piece for that recording. He also did a great job, and they've made their career more. They're very classically trained violinists, and they made their career mostly on contemporary music, both of them. And I think most of their actual training, like at their universities, um, was still mostly classical. And I think contemporary is what they did, for fun, um, as when they were students.
it seems innovative, but I kind of like it. It does. It has to do with what is accepted, more widely accepted. There's a conversation there. Um, I wanted to ask like about this piece, about the what you mentioned about the dynamics, the fluctuating dynamics. They remind me of, like, would you say that they are like a residue of your past self as a composer, because they are kind of very romantic or expressionist inspired? That's what I see in those.
Um, I think I don't. I almost feel like maybe it has to do with the fact that my upbringing as a horn player, and that if you listen to even very high level horn playing, um, articulation is so hard to be like very perfect and clear and precise on the horn. And even at the highest level, they'll be like, if you really listen in, you'll notice so many imperfections. Um, and I think as an A-type personality, that kind of like drives me crazy at some points. So I think I started to develop a preference away from articulation a lot of the time. So I had like a lot of these like fade in, fade out. And I feel like if I really think what sounds do I actually prefer listening to, I think it would be more the fade in, fade out. I don't know if I really love the sound of transients, even though I load my music up with them nowadays. But yeah, I think it was a preference, and I think a lot of it became from a preference, maybe due to my background as an orchestral horn player,
Um, yeah. Well,
which I was still pretty into. I mean, I was just starting. I was just at a point my first year of college. I didn't know if I wanted to study. I always knew I wanted to study music. I didn't know if it was going to be composition or horn playing. And really, like basically right before I started, every college I applied to at that time was like, you know, you can do either, but you have to pick one. We're not going to let you do both. Which, in retrospect, I'm not sure. I don't agree with that advice, but that was the advice I was given from everybody. And so I decided to, you know, take composition, but I had really just several months taken that focus, and I was still pretty involved in playing horn, and I was very involved in that horn department, especially at the beginning of my studies at um, Northwestern there. So I was definitely, yeah, still in that kind of, I think a large part of, especially about studying horn at a conservatory, is all about orchestral playing. Um,
most likely.
yeah.
Shantin, do you want to chime in any of the topics that we've been talking about, like the form or intuition writing through composed form, the implications of an opus one?
I think I I'm a composer who relies mostly on intuition. So somehow I think it's good to have such a great intuition, especially when we were young. I believe if we never had such an intuition, it is very hard to be a composer. I I think both of you know that I'm very enthusiastic about playing chess. One
Mhm.
thing about playing chess is you need to come up with some candidate moves when you calculate what to do next. But because we are not computer, we are not like chess engine that we really consider like every possible legal moves. So we need to have some kind of intuition that we pick something and we calculate upon that. And I believe music composition and as well as a lot of artistic thing are pretty similar in the sense that if we don't really have our intuition, we find it very hard to move forward. We may have a hard time to keep on writing, but maybe as time go by, when Megan discovered a lot of various new things, new ideas, or maybe when you uh, discover something that you find more worthwhile to explore, then then the intuition may be maybe less important or maybe less obvious because maybe your new knowledge, new techniques, new ideas somehow took over.
Hmm.
However, I believe a lot of decision was made, or or some choices were preferred because of our preferences, our intuition. I think it is also true for a lot of composer, at least for myself. But but when we talk about Opus One, I agree that maybe that is a place that we can reflect about about ourselves, and at least every journey has a starting point. There must be one point that begins everything. Yeah, and and I would say your starting point is very high though. Yeah, to be
Thanks.
honest, a very nice piece, and yeah, and it is very explosive too, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that was who I was. I mean, I think there was a little bit of that, especially at the beginning of Buffalo. I was definitely like off the charts energy, where I could barely like control my physical like presence. I was always moving and fidgeting around. And I feel like I've calmed down, or maybe just have less energy as I've aged because I'm old. Uh, but yeah, I think that's kind of expressed
The kids too.
in
Yes.
yeah, in my music for sure. Um, yeah, I think also I just remember being very. I also remember I was very influenced by Aaron Cassidy, but I also I was taking private lessons at the time with Aaron Travers, who now teaches at the University of Indiana, and I remember very clearly like I my music was so dense before this piece. Um, this piece is significantly less dense than anything I've ever written. I think I was very into the idea that like, you know, if someone does something virtuosic, it's like impressive and good, and like the more notes, like the more chords, the more crazy rhythms, like the better my piece is. Um, because that's I think a very common thought of somebody who is like a teenager writing music. I see that in a lot of young composers I teach too. But that was definitely my thought process, and I think he was able to he was I think the only thing he wanted to teach me was that like more wasn't necessarily more in music, that less can be more. And he would always tell me that, and I would always like be like look at him like you're ridiculous, like obviously more is better, whatever. And then I remember one lesson really clearly. He had us improvise the whole lesson, and one of us had to improvise just using a paper bag and like a grocery bag, and one of no, I think it wasn't a paper bag. It was a plastic bag. It was a plastic grocery bag, and then the other person could just make sounds with their hands on the table, on a wooden table. Um, so we had these very simplified instruments, and I was surprised. We were able to create really interesting things, especially once we improvised for a while. We got more creative with the instrumentation, and so I think that was something that was a really defining thing to me. Like, oh wow, like I can create interest with something a lot more simple. than what I had thought. Um, yeah, and I think especially with the timpani isn't a a virtuosic instrument in a conventional meaning of that word anyway. Um, yeah, allowed me to think about that different. Yes, I had just like a lot of people who were able to approach me in a way that I was receptive to. Um, yeah.
I can notice that another trend is like working for, and that, well, we mentioned this, but working with specific performers, like the
Mm-hmm.
pieces are tailor made. You may say, you can say that you are a composer that make pieces that are tailor made for performers in a way, and that you think your pieces that
Yeah.
way, pretty much like various sequenzas or something that
I mean,
similar.
I think both of the performers I
And I think
wrote
it
for
didn't
have very
didn't
distinct and unique personalities as um, a both a person and a musician. And I mean, they were both older than me, and I really looked up to them as musicians. I just thought like, wow, like and people. I thought these were like really incredible people who were just so uniquely themselves, and that's how I wanted to be. And it was transformation. I remember when I first started the piece, Ari was pretty much on board right away. He was, very comfortable and familiar playing all sorts of extended techniques. But Catherine was much less like she was less so. Um, we were kind of in similar headspaces. I think she was very um, she didn't like it. She even told me at first, like, I really don't like this piece, and that I was that was hard for me to hear as a 19-year-old. Um, but I stood ground because I mean I think at that point like I didn't know if I wanted to be a composer. I was just trying to write something. Um, and she was at the same point I was where she wasn't just if she didn't like something, she didn't just like not give it any attention. She wanted to kind of delve in and figure out why she didn't like something. Um, and so it was kind of a really interesting experience. Like you could see she was very like disconnected from the piece when I first initially started, and as I got more material together, she really became very passionate about the piece. And so much of her personality started getting delved into the piece too. And I ended up writing her a set of solo timpani works as well. Um, and yeah, she's someone I became friends with, and um, she flew in from California to play that 3 years later for my senior recital. So yeah, it definitely it was this like we all kind of transformed and come together for this piece, which was made it really. It makes it more special, I think, for me, and I think influenced the piece for sure, and I think a positive way.
um two questions. How why why or how did you think about the microtonal aspects of the piece? Tones,
Uh
rhythm.
huh. Um, I think I
How are you?
mostly just
Because this is the first time since I have never met your pitch centric self.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of weird to me to see some interest for microtones here.
I
Not
think the
only
microphones like.
and
So it's definitely different. Yeah.
use of microtones, of microtonal languages.
I think the microtones weren't like they probably were a poor choice for a notation in retrospect. I think I wanted the piece to sound um more gestural and not so guided in specific pitch, and I wanted these like really small pitch inflections. So I think that was the way because I'm like, oh, I want small pitch inflections. And the other reason was because I wanted a full glissando of the string, but I didn't want the sound of the open string.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of my microtones are like a microtone above the the open string. Um, so a lot of it had to do with the more of a physical aspect of not wanting that open string. Um, but I do think maybe having all the microtone notation makes it seem like I have different priorities, because people who do extensively use microtones in their music, I think about microtones much differently than that. Where this was more like of a practical physical thing. Yeah, maybe not the best notation. I mean, it works fine, I guess. They played it, but yeah, at least from an aesthetical point, studying the piece, maybe a little bit of a misleading notation.
Yeah, and the other question I had was like, uh, with who you were studying, where when you were writing this, did that teacher point out like, here, this is the future Megan, this is more Megan, and this is the old Megan? Because I had that in what I would consider my Opus One in the end, like, uh, my
That
old,
people were trying to
not
press you to write a certain way.
not not really, just upon analyzing it when it was finished, particularly, like, uh okay, this is more like, this seems to be the path that you are going to take, and this is the path that you have already taken here, like making
Um,
differences.
yeah, I mean, I think people were very, very support. All my teachers, I had a lot of support writing this piece, and a lot of encouragement, a lot of hand holding, and things I needed at that time for sure. Um, and I do think that everybody recognized that it was a huge stylistic shift. I don't think people necessarily knew if that was going to be like the new trajectory of my music
If
or
that
if
was
they expected it to be that way.
do you think
I think for sure they had to see how passionate I was about this project and what I was doing here, and it was a very different level of enthusiasm than I had for anything else I had done. So I mean, probably they could have probably assumed that based on that. Um, but I had teachers that were, I was just very fortunate, really, in all of both at Northwestern and at University of Buffalo, that like style was never imposed or encouraged in any certain way. That I really did feel stylistically free, and I had colleagues there, like the graduates, um, composers that I looked up to. None of them wrote music that's like mine, and none of them wrote music like each other's. Much like the environment we had in Buffalo. I love that. So I was fortunate to be in kind of in situations like that. But yeah, I think um, I think it was they were surprised when I started writing this because it was a big shift, but they were very supportive, and it must have been obvious to them that was a direction that I wanted to pursue because it was very clear I had a lot of passion for that.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
That's all I have, pretty much. Like, Shantin, do you want to add anything else?
Mm, I think I'm good.
Megan,
Yeah.
do
I
you
mean,
want to
no,
say
I
anything?
mean, I think I look at the time too, like that I was really first listening with or maybe at least a significantly, I was listening with an open ear to all sorts of contemporary music at that time for the first time ever. Um, and it was the most exciting time I've ever had musically. Like, just the fact that I had already been studying music for a long time, and I could find all this music that could question like my interpretation of what music was and really expand that definition. And it was just, I mean, I was just euphoric on all the music I was discovering. Yeah, it's a fun, I think it's a fun, at least for me, it was a really fun part of my life. Now I feel like I listen to music in a much more jaded way because I've heard so much more music, and
Yeah,
it's very infrequently where I hear something that feels really new. Um, so
I'm
yeah, just different.
excited about something. Yeah, I kind of miss like all that discovery process,
Yeah.
going after scores. How is this written? Yeah, it's kind of like it's hard to get that now,
Oh yeah.
especially when you when I will say probably, well, I don't know if I'm gonna speak out of ignorance here, but especially when kind of like what is promoted, it seems to be kind of like going back to older, more conservative languages of writing. Like, it
Yeah.
doesn't seem like the innovation, the exploration of the individual, of the more idiosyncratic is pushed for anymore. I might be
Yeah,
speaking.
I mean, I guess like I mean when we had Zane on many moons ago, he talked about how, composers that were being more innovative were just kind of, instead of reflecting on romantic music, we're just reflecting on, the 60s and 70s. And I get his point, but at the same time, I feel like the 60s and 70s, maybe the 80s a little bit, but especially the 60s and 70s were maybe the last generation where being innovative and radical was encouraged and promoted and supported. Um, and so people who want to be innovative kind of look a lot to that time period because we have all these pieces that were easily showcased, um, that had that mentality where they're still there, but they're buried behind forgotten composers most of the time now, or student composers, not the composers that gather the most attention.
No, for certain. And it's like the way I feel, the way I see it, the way I perceive it, it's like there was some kind of development that kind of stopped there where you mentioned, and it didn't get further developed even with the composers that were doing it. Like, we can mention Ligeti, we can mention Penderecki and how they went back to more conservative
Mhm.
language towards the
Even
80s.
Lacaman too, maybe not as extreme as those examples, but I think even Lacaman did get a little bit more conservative.
Yeah, definitely. Um, uh, hmm, that's I will say that's a probably a leitmotif of this stream of this podcast of this that we
Yeah.
are always gonna be going back to and wondering why or just thinking about because that's what kind of like pretty much got us to be composers. If it wasn't for that excitement, I don't think I would have ended up studying what I studied in the end.
No, I mean, I
And
I don't
you
know
just
what I would have studied, but I don't. I would have. I mean, I was literally looking to change majors before I kind of just stumbled into a project that made me open to experiencing contemporary music and people who presented it in a way that made it seem approachable to me. And like all these graduate students, I mean, they were listening to all this. Like, I remember I was just like, Lachenmann was a name that was brought up frequently. There was a lot of the graduate students who really enjoyed listening to Lachenmann, and they just spoke about his music in a way that was so, it seemed so intellectual and so intelligent. And I was just like, what? I was just really wanted to know more about it. Even if I wasn't going to like the music, I just wanted to understand, like, what was it about the music, and like, why was I not resonating with it? And then I found, when I went deeper into the music, that I was resonating with it, actually, that it was just that I was, um, it sounded so different from what I had heard at that point, being, mostly, very just classically trained and spending so much time in conventional orchestras. It was such a strikingly different sound that I was just noticing the difference and not really listening to it. Um, but when I actually got over the fact that, okay, this is different, and still listened to it and actually really listened to it, I was able to experience something new.
yeah,
Um,
that
New for
sparked
me. Yeah.
for me too, and that kind of sparked an obsession over
Mhm.
that type of music, and I wanted to see how it was written and study it in depth and listen to it over and over and over. Like
Mhm.
uh, that stimuli, it's hard to come by nowadays.
Oh, it is.
I'll just leave it there. It's like,
And
I,
I always like, that's one thing I always encourage my students, like, we all can have our own opinions, but I feel like if you're going to say I dislike this, you should know why. Like, you should listen carefully enough that you could answer that question, like, why do you dislike this? And if you have an answer that, then everyone's welcome to their own opinion. But I think if you don't, you're missing out on so many amazing experiences if you don't actually allow yourself to listen enough to understand maybe why you don't like something, or maybe give yourself the opportunity to appreciate it and like it. um yeah, I can't imagine not knowing, all this music. Yeah, it was really just really an exciting period, and I try to approach life in that way, where I try to approach it as judgmental, as with as little judgmental as possible, so I can really experience things. Because when we go too quickly to judge things, we aren't really able to experience them.
no, you're right. And I think that those are some pretty wise words to close this
Yeah.
stream. Anything to add? from yourself or something?
I'm
Yeah.
I think I I when you say like when we or when students wants to say I dislike, I don't like anything, we better have a reason. Yeah, for me, I have changed my preferences quite a lot. If
Oh yeah.
I if I have to look back to what I composed 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, or what I'm writing currently, the changes, a lot of changes are pretty radical. Yeah, yeah, very wise that we should we should look for a reason, or we need to be more honest when we say we
Hmm.
don't like one thing. Is it just because we don't want to accept new things, or is it really um or is it really like something that we find inferior, or we don't really like? Yeah,
Hmm.
because we may regret one day. When I was very young, I honestly didn't like Lachman, and
Hmm.
I don't compose like Lachman even nowadays, but I like his music quite a lot. At least a few. At least I I could listen to it. And when I
Hmm.
was younger, I would say no, 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 don't show me this. I don't want to hear that, something like that, right? So I think
Hmm.
a lot of time, a lot of time, actually, our preferences change, and yeah, we need to, and somehow I sometimes I tell my students, because my students are most of them they only play the instruments as a hobby, so they had a lot of preferences that are different from ours. So I would say, just imagine that this kind of music has survived for years, for decades, or even for centuries, at least for the sake of knowing something that a lot of people like, and or knowing parts of our civilization. We need to respect those things, respect whatever Tchaikovsky or Beethoven, like or dislike, we respect them. We try to learn a little bit or understand them. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Definitely. Um, yeah, you've said it all, man. And Megan, I don't have anything to add. I think. In that,
Yeah.
uh, we can wrap it up here.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, next time it will be my Opus One, I think, right? Or
Yeah.
something.
I think
I
something said he already shared his. His was the percussion duo that we.
The percussion duo, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So it's my turn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's see how it goes next time, and how we
Yeah.
reflect upon what is an Opus One and how it affects what it means to the individuality of the composer, of the development of artistic integrity, style, aesthetics, all of that will be fun as always. So, uh,
Yeah.
take care, everyone.
Be
Take care.
safe.